For today's video we're going to take another look at the Prinzflex 135mm f2.8 M42 screw fit lens. I'll put a link to the previous video on the screen about now. As I mentioned in the last video, this is actually a Chinon lens that was rebadged as a Prinzflex and sold by the Dixons Group in the UK. I've had a message from a viewer who's got one of these lenses, and he's taken his apart and can't remember how to put it back together. It's the rear end with the aperture mechanism that he's having trouble with, so we're going to take the rear end apart and have a look at it, and hopefully that'll help them get their lens back together. As with taking any lens apart, there's plenty that can go wrong, so I wouldn't necessarily want to start off with an expensive lens that I was really fond of. I'd be inclined to buy a fairly basic, old, vintage lens if you want to start taking them apart, to see the kind of things you'll come up against. But remember, the more complex modern lenses get increasingly more difficult to take apart with a lot more elements inside. Anyway, for this lens, the first thing we're going to do is take the mount section off the back. The mount section is held on with 4 screws, so you'll want to get yourself a fine screwdriver and just undo those. They shouldn't be too tight, it should be relatively easy. And I've got myself a little tray to put the screws in. Get those out, and then that section should just lift off. And you might want to put some sort of mark on so you can remember the orientation of this part, although there is only one way it can actually go back. But I'll put myself a little blob from a paint pen where the focus mark is on the lens, or thereabouts, and that should do just fine. And then we'll lift the mount section off like that. Looking at the mount itself, you've got the little automatic pin here that automatically closes down the iris on certain cameras, and that actually operates this little lever in here to close down the iris as you take the photo. Not all cameras had that feature, so you have the auto manual switch over here that moves a little section that overrides the pin, so when it's in manual position, as soon as you move the aperture ring, the iris will close accordingly. And looking at the lens itself, the lever on the end of the pin on the mount holds this section of the lens, or this curved lever, in this position, and as you can see the iris is sprung loaded so it's shut normally, but that little lever will hold this open so the iris is open until you take the photo, at which point in time it'll shut the iris to the position set on the aperture ring. The manual auto switch just overrides that by pulling this sort of semicircular lever into the closed position, so the iris will remain wherever it's set on the aperture ring, like that. So there's a few bits we can carefully take off to start taking the lens apart. There's a little plate here that guides that semicircular lever, and that is held on with 2 small screws. So we'll take those out carefully. Actually, I'll use a different screwdriver that's got a bit of magnetism, because that should pick up the screw nicely, and pop that in my tray, and then do the same with the second screw on this bit. Try not to get my hands in the way of the camera or the light, and get that one out, and the plate as well, that's fine. Those are out of the way. And it's worth taking photos or a video if you're taking the lens apart, so you can look at them to refer how things go together. Next, we'll take the semicircular lever itself out, so hang on, I'll rotate the lens for this. Okay, this is the other end of that semicircular lever, and it has a screw with a shoulder that mounts it to the chassis of the lens. So, we'll see if we can get that one out. Again, hopefully I'm not in the way of the camera, so undo that, and I'll leave the lever in place for now, but just pop the screw out. Okay, that's the screw out, So now we'll remove that semicircular lever itself. It has a long post that goes down on this side that actually contacts the lower aperture operating mechanism. So as I drag this out with a pair of tweezers, you can see there's this long post, and that has to sit on this side of the little shiny lever that's down in the lens. I don't know if you can see it, but down here, that operates the iris. If it was the wrong side of it, it wouldn't operate it. So it has to be this side, so it operates it like that. So next we'll remove the aperture ring itself, but be careful before you do this. There will be a spring-loaded ball that if you're not careful it'll be flying off around your room and you'll never find it again. So a couple of things to remember with the aperture ring. There's going to be a long pair of levers. They'll be mounted on this shiny bit here that actually operate the cam that sets the iris itself, and that needs to go back in the right place. But the little spring-loaded ball is over here, so I'm going to rotate that round to the back, and you can see, hopefully, let's have a look. Well, you can just about see. This lens has a little leaf spring that prods a rod that prods the ball that's in here. So as I withdraw the aperture ring, there's a real good risk that that ball will go flying around the place. So I've got a little bit of plastic. Let's just see. Ease the ring off, and then I need to get me a bit of plastic in here so that ball doesn't go flying. Which it hasn't done, that's good. So now I'm going to get the ball on the end of my magnetic screwdriver if I can. There it is, it's tiny, and pop that in my tray, because if you lose that, well, you're going to have to find another ball, unless you want a notchless aperture ring, in which case you can leave the ball out. And yes, the aperture ring itself, these are the two long prongs that go either side of a little sort of tab on the cam that operates the iris. We'll show you that in a minute. So the next thing to come off, there's a small screw just here that is the only thing left remaining that holds this chassis part in place. So if I undo that, small crosshead screw, and again that should stick to my magnetic screwdriver quite nicely, and pop that in the tray. So now I should be able to lift this section out. Again, be aware there's still the prongy part that operates the notch ball for the aperture ring, so you don't want to lose that, so just keep an eye on how you orientate that bit. So hopefully now we've got a reasonable view down into the lens itself, and you can see the shiny section here is the cam that selects where the iris is going to stop. It operates against a little spring-loaded lever down here. If I move that, you'll see the iris opens and shuts. And the lever down this side is the one that the semicircular lever drops down onto. So the semicircular lever moves this shiny lever which operates the iris, but the actual position the iris will stop at is determined by this cam here, which wherever it stops is where the iris will shut down to, and that, as I say, operates on this little spring-loaded lever down here. And oh yes, the little tab on this cam is just down here, and that is the one, whoops, that the two prongs of the aperture ring go round. So looking in a little more detail, this is the little tab that the semicircular lever on the back of the lens touches, and you've got a return spring here that actually closes the iris. And then the sort of metal ring round here is part of the cam that changes the position the iris will go to. So turning the lens through 180 degrees, you can see the plate with the cam on it just here, and the little tab that the actual aperture ring contacts is this bit here. So if I move that cam, you'll see the iris open up to its widest there, and you can see that it operates this little lever down here, which sets the position of the iris itself. And another quick reposition just so you can see the little lever that operates the iris in a bit clearer. So the lever is down here, and you'll see as I move the cam it touches that lever to change the position that the iris will close to. Hopefully that'll give enough detail to help them put their lens back together, so I think now I'll start reassembling my lens. So first we'll put the chassis section back in place. It can only go one way because there's a pair of screw holes close together here that line up with the pair of screw holes in the chassis plate itself. And then the small crosshead screw goes into the hole there, and I bet my hands are in the way of the camera. Next I'll put the aperture ring back on. This will be a bit tricky to do because I really need my head to be in the way of the camera, but I'll see what I can do and hopefully not lose the little ball bearing. So the little ball bearing pops into the hole with the springy plunger. Right, the ball bearing's in place. Get the aperture ring ready, and its two prongs have got to go over the little tab on the cam ring, so that's them in place on the cam ring, and I'll drop it down as far as it will go, but it's now sitting on the little ball bearing. So I now need to prod the ball bearing in so I can actually drop the aperture ring into place. So let's see if I can get something onto it. Okay, that's done, and it's clicking, so that's good. So don't pull that back off now, otherwise your ball bearing will fly around the room. So you'll probably have noticed on that bit of footage that I actually didn't get the prongs of the aperture ring lined up with the tab on the cam for the iris. So I'm going to redo that off camera so I can actually see what I'm doing rather than working from the side. So I'll return in a minute. And it's amazing how much easier that was to do when I could actually see what I was doing rather than working from the side with the camera and the light in the way. Anyway, that's back together the correct way now. And next to go on is the semicircular lever. The prongy bit has to go on the far side of the little shiny lever in the bottom, so it'll actually operate the aperture mechanism. So that drops into place, and then we'll just get the screw to screw for its pivot point. And there we go. So next we've got the small guide plate that keeps the semicircular lever in place. If you look at its side profile, it drops down from its mounting points to guide the semicircular lever. So it goes that way round, something like that. And then there's the two screws that secure that in place. So let's see if we can keep that down. I'm probably in the way of the camera, but there we go, that's the first screw in. And the second one. So the only thing left to do is the actual back flange of the lens itself. Seems easier if you open the iris up to start this procedure and then move the semicircular lever to one side, and then the little levery part that the pin activates needs to go into the gap here. So drop that into place. See if I've got the screw holes lined up. Now if I close the aperture now, and yeah, that's working correctly, and so is the manual switch. So I've just got to line the holes, the screws up with the holes, and that should be in the right place. It's one screw, Okay, that's the screws tightened up and everything's working correctly. The little auto pin, not that I'll be likely to use it with a camera that actually uses that function, but may as well have it assembled correctly, and the auto manual lever is also working correctly. So that is now back together. So I think all we need to do now is show a few examples of the lens functioning, and then that'll be job done. Hopefully that'll have helped someone to put their lens back together. And yeah, I'll put a link to the previous video at the end of this, so you can watch that one where we actually fix a fault with the focusing ring on this same lens. So here are a few bits of test footage shot with the lens wide open. It gives a lovely fall off from the subject into the blurred background, and for the price it's really good value for money. I've got it fitted to a micro four thirds camera, so the 135mm is equivalent to a 270mm lens. Anyway, I think that's about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. There'll be plenty more vintage stuff coming soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.